Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's legal team have been in contact with the Daily Mail after it republished allegations made in Andrew Lowney's new book entitled...
They kept this secret for 7 years, and when it finally came out, it destroyed everything. Harry is gone, vanished to Botswana, alone, cut off from his own children. And Meghan, she just lost control of everything she spent years building because of a single document she signed before the wedding that nobody was ever supposed to find.
For my own mental health, for my wife's. So it did seem a little bit strange that somehow the rules were being changed or that I was being guided on a very different path. This is not a surprise to anybody. It's really sad that it's got to this point, but I've got to do something.
The Crown knew they were always waiting, and the moment the pattern became undeniable, they moved fast, faster than anyone thought possible. What was inside that prenup will shock you, because once you know, everything suddenly makes sense. To understand how we got here, you have to go back further than January. You have to go back to 2018, to the months leading up to the marriage of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Prenuptial agreements in royal marriages are not unusual. They are not romantic, but they are standard. When a marriage involves individuals connected to the line of succession, when it involves assets, titles, and children who will carry constitutional relevance from the moment they are born, the legal groundwork tends to be thorough. What made this particular agreement significant was not its existence. It was one specific clause buried within it. That clause addressed the children. It acknowledged in plain legal language that any children born of the union would carry succession relevance under constitutional law. It stated that in scenarios of documented custodial instability, the Crown retained standing to invoke protective structural review. And it specified that neither parent could unilaterally relocate the children outside agreed jurisdictional parameters without coordinated notification through the appropriate channels. Meghan signed it. The date stamp confirms it. The witness signatures confirm it. Independent legal counsel was present on both sides. The terms were entered into voluntarily. For years, that clause remained dormant. There was no reason to invoke it. But dormant is not the same as gone. And in late January 2026, a sequence of events began to unfold that would cause that clause to move from an archived legal document into active institutional consideration faster than almost anyone anticipated. On January the 29th, a confidential memo began circulating within internal channels connected to royal legal oversight. The memo did not make accusations. It did not speculate. It is documented. The language was measured but carried an unmistakable sense of urgency beneath the surface. It referenced irregular communication patterns, missed confirmation protocols, and what it described as prenuptial compliance deviation indicators. No firm conclusions were drawn at that stage. It was a record of signals, not a verdict. 2 days later, on January the 31st, something more concrete happened. Archie and Lilibet were withdrawn from their private school in Santa Barbara. The withdrawal was immediate. There was no transition plan on file. There was no transfer documentation logged with the UK. Liaison operating under the existing custodial framework. No new school was named. No spring enrolment was arranged. No forward academic structure of any kind was put in place. Where paperwork should have been, there was silence. A California-based school administrator flagged the discrepancy internally. Under ordinary circumstances, a parent is entirely within their rights to remove a child from a school without providing a detailed explanation. But this was not an ordinary circumstance. Under an active cross-border custodial structure involving children with royal status, specific notification obligations exist. There are welfare checkpoints built into the framework precisely because these are not purely private individuals. Those checkpoints were bypassed. Let that register for a moment. The file that began to form around these events does not characterize what happened as criminal. It records a deviation from agreed structure. In institutions that are built on structure, that kind of deviation functions as an early warning signal. It is the first alarm before the alarm becomes louder. By the end of that same week, further irregularities had surfaced. Previously scheduled medical appointments for the children in California were cancelled. There was no documented rescheduling. Correspondence between legal representatives indicated that instructions had been given to restrict communication between royal education liaison contacts and certain third-party advisors. The tone of that correspondence shifted noticeably, from cooperative to something more guarded. Then the financial picture came into focus. A £3 million trust, reportedly allocated specifically to provide UK-based educational stability for the children, had been dissolved. The documentation surrounding the dissolution did not characterise the funds as misused. It simply confirmed that the protective structure no longer existed in its secured form. Dissolution is a technical word. What it means in practice is that the safeguard was gone. When you lay these events side by side and look at the dates, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. January 29th, the memo. January 31st, the school withdrawal. Within that same compressed window, medical cancellations, a dissolved trust, communication resistance, and underneath all of it, a prenuptial agreement that had specifically outlined these kinds of compliance patterns as triggers for institutional review. Princess Anne did not respond to any of this publicly. She did not call a press conference, she did not issue a statement, she requested the file. The red folder containing the documentation accumulated across that week was placed before her at Windsor in the early hours of February 2nd. It was marked for immediate custodial review. Those who were present later described the atmosphere in that room as procedural rather than emotional. Princess Anne is not known for reacting dramatically. She is known for requiring documentation before she moves. The contents of the folder gave her that documentation. School removal without the required notifications. Medical oversight gaps. Financial restructuring that had affected protections tied to the children. Legal correspondence reflecting resistance to shared custodial coordination. None of those elements, taken individually, represents a catastrophic failure. But institutions do not evaluate elements individually when they cluster like this. They evaluate the pattern, and the pattern that emerged from that folder was coherent and concerning. It was at this point that the prenuptial agreement moved from background context to central document, because the events that had unfolded across that week did not just raise welfare questions in a general sense. They mapped, with uncomfortable precision, onto the exact compliance triggers that had been written into the agreement Meghan had signed 8 years earlier. The clause about coordinated notification, the clause about jurisdictional protocols, the clause about custodial stability. The architecture that had been built before the marriage had, in effect, anticipated the situation now sitting in a folder on a table at Windsor. Princess Anne reviewed the sequence twice before closing the file. She then made a request that had not been made in decades. She asked for a formal review of dormant custodial safeguards embedded within constitutional precedent. These are protections designed for genuine instability scenarios involving royal minors. They are not casual instruments. They exist because history has shown that institutions need contingency frameworks, and those frameworks are drafted precisely so that they do not have to be improvised in moments of pressure. The fact that this review was requested at all indicated that those inside Windsor had moved past the stage of waiting to see whether the situation resolved itself. The documentation had shifted the question from whether there was cause for concern to what level of response that concern warranted. How did it come to this? A legal agreement signed in private before cameras rolled on a wedding that felt like a fairy tale to much of the world. A clause about children who had not yet been born. A dormant framework that sat untouched for years. And then within a single week in January 2026, a school withdrawal, cancelled appointments, a dissolved trust, and a memo that connected all of it to prenuptial compliance requirements that had apparently not been met. The institution did not panic. It did not react with visible emotion. It did what institutions are built to do. It opened the file, examined the pattern, and began to move. Slowly at first, then with the kind of precision that only comes from years of preparation for scenarios exactly like this one. What happened next would take the situation from internal documentation to constitutional action. But at this stage, in the early hours of February, it was still paper. Dates, signatures, timestamps, and a pattern that nobody inside that room could look at and reasonably describe as coincidence. The prenuptial agreement Meghan had signed was no longer a private document sitting in an archive. It was the foundation of everything that was about to follow. When a legal agreement is signed before a wedding, most people assume it will spend its entire existence in a drawer. It is a precaution, a formality, something negotiated in quiet rooms by lawyers who are paid to anticipate the worst while everyone else is focused on the flowers and the guest list. In most cases, those agreements never see the light of day again. The marriage either holds together or it falls apart through ordinary means, and the document simply confirms what was already informally understood about the division of assets. But this agreement was different, not because of the financial clauses, not because of the asset separation provisions, because of what it said about the children. The clause in question was not buried in obscure legal language designed to confuse. It was precise because it had to be. When children are born into the line of succession, their status is not purely personal. It carries constitutional weight that extends far beyond the preferences of either parent. The individuals who drafted this agreement understood that. They built a framework accordingly. What the clause established in practical terms was this: any children born of the marriage would be recognized as carrying succession relevance under constitutional law. In scenarios where documented custodial instability emerged, defined by specific compliance indicators, the Crown retained standing to invoke protective structural review. Neither parent held the unilateral right to relocate the children outside agreed jurisdictional parameters without coordinated notification through the appropriate legal channels. It is worth pausing on that last point. Not unilateral relocation, without coordinated notification. That is not an unusual condition in agreements involving individuals with constitutional responsibilities. What made it significant in January 2026 was the events that had just occurred. A school withdrawal with no forward plan, no notification to the UK liaison, no new institution named. That was, by the letter of the agreement Meghan had signed, precisely the kind of action the clause was designed to flag. When Princess Anne requested the review, the pre-nuptial framework was already being examined in parallel by royal legal advisors. The question they were working through was not whether the agreement existed. It clearly did. The question was whether the pattern of events documented in that week met the threshold required to move from passive compliance monitoring into active institutional response. The answer, as the documentation was assembled and cross-referenced, was becoming clearer by the hour. The school withdrawal aligned with the notification provisions. The dissolved trust aligned with the financial stability protections embedded in the agreement. The communication resistance from legal representatives aligned with the coordinated oversight requirements. Each element, cross-referenced against the signed terms, pointed in the same direction. Inside Windsor, the process that followed was not rushed. That is important to understand. Institutions of this kind do not move quickly because they are panicking. They move quickly when the documentation gives them no legitimate reason to move slowly. The preparation for a scenario like this one had been built into the legal architecture years in advance. When the moment arrived, the machinery was already assembled. It simply needed to be switched on. Prince William was briefed on the situation in full. His response was measured. He asked a specific question about procedural thresholds. He wanted to understand at what precise point the documented deviations crossed from a compliance concern into a custodial vulnerability under the terms of the signed agreement. The legal advisors working through the file were approaching a definitive answer but had not yet reached one. What they could confirm was that the threshold was close, closer than anyone had expected it to be when the week began. The Edwardian Protocol entered the conversation at this stage. It is worth explaining what that is because the name itself tells you very little. It is a continuity mechanism, not a punishment instrument. It was drafted in the shadow of institutional trauma, refined in the aftermath of the 1936 abdication crisis, and preserved as a constitutional safeguard against instability that might touch the line of succession. Its underlying logic is straightforward and deliberately severe. No individual, regardless of their position through blood or marriage, stands above the continuity of the Crown. The protocol does not ask whether a parent loves their children. That is not the question it is designed to answer. It asks a narrower and more specific question. Are the structural interests of the monarchy at risk of destabilization through custodial unpredictability? When the answer to that question crosses a defined threshold, the protocol provides a framework for response. Prince William did not announce its activation. He requested a review. That distinction matters more than it might initially appear. A review means the documentation is being formally assessed against the protocol's criteria. It does not yet mean a decision has been made, but it signals that the situation has moved beyond informal family discussion into the territory of constitutional consideration. The Privy Council was convened. There were no cameras present. There was no public docket. Sealed briefing packets were distributed, containing the accumulated documentation from the preceding week, alongside the relevant sections of the pre-nuptial agreement and the Edwardian protocol criteria. The individuals in that room understood the weight of what they were being asked to consider. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Unanimity in a setting like this does not mean everyone in the room felt comfortable with the outcome. It means that the documentation presented left insufficient grounds for any member to argue against the threshold having been crossed. The pattern was coherent. The prenuptial compliance deviations were documented. The custodial instability indicators were on the record. The vote reflected institutional alignment, not personal enthusiasm. What followed the vote moved with speed and precision. Several measures were implemented in close succession, each one flowing directly from the enforcement architecture that the signed agreement had established years earlier. The first was a passport freeze. The international travel rights of Archie and Lilibet were suspended pending dual authorization under Crown oversight. This was not presented as a dramatic seizure. It was processed as an administrative entry into the security registry. Legally framed as protective stabilization, its practical effect was to ensure that no cross-border relocation could occur without coordinated approval from the appropriate authorities. The spontaneous removal of the children to another jurisdiction was no longer a possibility. The second measure was an image rights lockdown. Under the Windsor Privacy Act of 2023, the commercial use of the children's names, likenesses, and any derivative branding was formally restricted for a period of 5 years. This was not framed as retroactive punishment for anything that had already occurred. It was described as forward containment, protecting the children's identities from commercial use during a period of custodial review. The third was the establishment of the Royal Restoration Fund. £12 million were allocated into a newly structured trust designed specifically for emotional stabilisation, private education, continuity and reintegration care within UK jurisdiction. This was a direct response to the dissolved £3 million structure that had appeared in the documentation from the preceding week. Unlike that dissolved fund, this new structure was secured under Crown trusteeship. Its parameters were defined. Its governance was clear. The financial protection that had previously been removed was now replaced with something considerably more robust and considerably more difficult to dissolve unilaterally. None of these measures were announced with fanfare. There were no press releases, no confrontations in hallways, no public statements dripping with institutional authority. There were signatures. And those signatures, quiet as they were, did something profound. They shifted the gravitational center of authority. Informal parental discretion, the kind that allows a parent to make day-to-day decisions without reference to anyone else, became secondary to institutional guardianship review. Not erased, subordinated. The distinction between those two words is significant. Meghan had not lost her status as a mother. She had lost the ability to act as the sole decision-maker in matters the prenuptial agreement had specifically placed under shared oversight. William signed not simply as a family member with a personal stake in the outcome, he signed as heir apparent. Princess Anne endorsed the measures not as an aunt with emotional ties to the children involved. She endorsed them as Princess Royal, in her capacity as custodian of procedural discipline. King Charles approved the framework with full sovereign awareness of what it meant. The mechanism had moved beyond analysis. It was operational. There is a question that lingered in that chamber, one that no official document would ever frame explicitly. Was this solely about protecting 2 children from perceived instability? Or was it also about insulating the future of the succession from reputational and commercial volatility that had begun to intersect with the children's identities in ways the institution found deeply uncomfortable? The official language remained focused on welfare, educational continuity, emotional consistency, and legal clarity. But the architecture of the response was unmistakably constitutional. And constitutional responses, when they involve the line of succession, protect more than the individuals immediately concerned. They protect the legitimacy of the institution itself. They protect the perception, carefully maintained across generations, that the succession is insulated from private turbulence. That insulation had now been reinforced. And reinforcement, in this context, carries a cost. Because once the Crown formally asserts structural guardianship oversight, the path back to the previous arrangement does not simply reopen when the immediate situation calms down. the Edwardian Protocol does not function on goodwill or apology. It functions on documented correction, on demonstrated compliance, on the kind of sustained, verifiable behavioral change that takes time to establish and cannot be fast-tracked by a single conciliatory gesture. The prenuptial agreement Meghan had signed had not been a trap. It had been a framework entered into knowingly, with independent legal representation on both sides. What it had established, in carefully measured legal language, was a set of conditions under which the Crown retained the right to step in. Those conditions had, by the documentation now sitting in sealed files across Windsor, been met. The agreement had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had converted a private family crisis into a constitutionally manageable process. Whether that felt like protection or like the closing of a door depended entirely on which side of it you were standing on. There is a particular kind of silence that follows institutional machinery when it moves with precision. It is not the silence of nothing happening, it is the silence of everything already having happened, of decisions already made, papers already signed, frameworks already activated. It settles over the people caught inside the situation like a weather system that arrived without warning, even though, in hindsight, every indicator had been pointing toward it for days. For Harry, that silence arrived in the form of a formal notice. His request for temporary visitation had been reviewed. It had been denied. The denial was not delivered with anger. It was not accompanied by accusation or personal condemnation. It did not question his character in explicit terms or make sweeping judgments about the kind of father he was or wanted to be. It was structured, paragraphed, and referenced under Appendix 4 of the Review Protocol. It acknowledged his parental status. It noted that emotional considerations had been weighed. And then it concluded in the measured language that institutions use when they want to convey finality without appearing cruel, that current logistical conditions did not meet the stabilization requirements necessary to proceed with the requested contact arrangement. The reasons listed were administrative, unresolved residency documentation, questions about income structure stability, active travel restrictions under the custodial stabilization framework, pending jurisdictional clarity between UK and US oversight structures. Each one, taken on its own, sounds like a solvable problem. A form that needs filling in, a document that needs updating, a technicality waiting to be resolved. But that is precisely the point about institutional logic. It does not confront you with one insurmountable wall. It presents you with a series of procedural requirements, and when you look at all of them together, you realize that meeting all of them simultaneously within the time frame that matters is not straightforward at all. Harry had spent years building a life that was explicitly designed to operate outside those kinds of structures. When he and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, the freedom that represented was real. Global flexibility, the ability to live and work across multiple jurisdictions without the constraints of formal royal protocols. An income structure built on their own terms through deals and partnerships and creative projects rather than through sovereign backing. These were not incidental features of the life they had chosen. They were the point of it. What the Stabilization Review had now done was take those same features and reframe every single one of them as a liability. Global flexibility had become jurisdictional ambiguity. An income built on independent enterprise had become unpredictable revenue flow, lacking sovereign backing. The freedom to move between countries had become a travel restriction concern. The institution had not changed its position on any of these things. It had simply waited until a moment when its framework gave it standing to assess them formally. And in that formal assessment, the life Harry had built outside the palace walls did not score well against the criteria the framework required. There was a detail that circulated quietly at the time, one that said something important about where things stood between Harry and Meghan at that point. His visitation request had been structured around a private meeting, without Meghan present. That detail matters. It was not the request of someone operating in full strategic alignment with their partner. It suggested, at minimum, a divergence in approach. He appeared to believe that his physical presence, his direct connection to his children, might carry weight with the institutional review in a way that paperwork alone could not achieve. That being there, being visible, might soften the procedural stance that had settled over the situation. But procedure is not softened by presence. It is satisfied by compliance. And compliance in this context meant documentation, residency clarity, income, transparency, and demonstrated alignment with the jurisdictional requirements laid out in the custodial framework. None of those things could be produced by showing up. They required a sustained and structured effort to bring his own circumstances into line with what the review demanded. That effort had not yet been made, or at least had not yet been demonstrated to the satisfaction of those assessing it. When the visitation denial reached him, Harry was not in London. He was not in California. He had gone to Botswana. The choice of that destination will not have been random, even if it was not announced with any official explanation. Botswana carries personal significance for Harry that goes back years. It is where he has spoken, in his own words, about feeling most himself, away from titles and protocols and the relentless weight of expectation that came with being born into the family he was born into. It is where he took Meghan early in their relationship, before the public knew she existed, before any of the machinery of royal scrutiny had turned its attention toward her. It was, in a real sense, where the private version of their story began. Returning there now, in circumstances this far removed from those early days, carried a weight that did not need to be explained out loud. Reports from that period described him as withdrawn, not in the dramatic sense that generates headlines, not visibly collapsing or making statements that invited further coverage, simply quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when someone is trying to process a situation that has moved faster than their ability to respond to it. There is a particular disorientation in discovering that the world has reorganized itself around your absence, that decisions have been made and votes have been cast and documents have been signed, and none of it required your input. When the Privy Council voted unanimously under Appendix 4, Harry was not in the room. He was not consulted before the vote. He was informed after alignment had already been achieved. That sequence is not a minor detail. For someone who was born inside that institution, who spent the first 3 decades of his life within its walls, who understood better than almost anyone outside it how it operated and what it prioritized, being informed after the fact rather than consulted before it was a message in itself. He was no longer a node in the decision-making structure. He was a variable being managed by it. The image rights lockdown had been sealed without his co-authorship. The Royal Restoration Fund had been structured without his input on its parameters. The passport restrictions had been implemented without his signature. He had been kept informed, technically speaking, but informed and included are very different things, and the gap between those two words was where Harry now found himself. There is a painful irony built into his position that does not require exaggeration to land. He had left the institution, partly to protect his family, specifically his wife, from what he described as the damaging effects of life inside the royal system. That framing had defined his public identity for years. It had earned him sympathy from a significant portion of the public. It had cost him a great deal within the institution itself, but he had appeared willing to absorb that cost in exchange for what he gained. Now the institution he had left was making decisions about his children, and the autonomy he had built outside its walls was being used by the review framework as evidence of instability rather than evidence of agency. He had not lost his children in any permanent or formally declared sense. The documentation was careful on that point. His parental status was acknowledged, but acknowledgement of parental status and operational access to your children are not the same thing. The visitation denial had made that distinction viscerally clear. He had the title without the access, the recognition without the proximity. He was a father in the documentation and a peripheral figure in reality. The financial picture that had emerged alongside the custodial measures added another layer to his situation. The second file that had begun circulating inside institutional channels contained references to commercial structures tied to the Sussex brand that Harry was now, in practical terms, unable to fully participate in or redirect. The image rights lockdown had complicated the monetization of projects involving the children. The passport restrictions had altered the logistical basis of the family's cross-border lifestyle. The centralization of financial oversight under Crown trusteeship had removed the flexibility that independent financial structures had previously provided. If Meghan's broader strategy had been built around a reinvention anchored in family visibility, in the kind of warm, accessible, humanized content that positions public figures as relatable rather than remote, then the institutional response had disrupted that strategy at its foundation. And Harry, whose name was attached to the brand even when the specific decisions may not always have been his, found himself caught in the fallout of a commercial architecture he had not entirely designed. being constrained by a constitutional framework he had not anticipated. What Botswana offered him at that moment was not answered. It offered distance. Physical distance from California, from Windsor, from the competing pressures of two worlds he no longer fully belonged to. He was not entirely Sussex in strategic terms because the containment measures had limited what that path could achieve. He was not restored to Windsor because the Edwardian activation had not come with an invitation back into the core of institutional authority. He occupied a corridor between two positions, and corridors, particularly in moments of acute institutional pressure, are not comfortable places to stand. The system he had once described as suffocating had not come after him with hostility. It had simply declined to open the door. It had categorized his circumstances as procedurally non-compliant and then continued operating with the same quiet efficiency it had always demonstrated. It did not hate him, it had assessed him, and the assessment had concluded that the life he had built, measured against the criteria the review required, did not currently meet the threshold for the access he was requesting. That is the particular cruelty of institutional logic when it is applied with precision. It does not need to be cruel to feel that way. It just needs to be consistent. And consistency, when it closes the door on someone who once lived on the other side of it, lands harder than any open confrontation ever could. He sat with that in Botswana, with the distance and the quiet and the question of what came next. The path back to influence ran through compliance, through documentation, through a structured effort, to demonstrate the kind of stability the review demanded. Whether he was ready to walk that path, and whether walking it would require a set of choices he had not yet resolved, remained unanswered. For now, there was just the silence that follows institutional machinery, and the horizon of a country that had once felt like the beginning of something. Now it marked a very different kind of threshold entirely. On the 3rd of February 2026, 3 people sat down in a private chamber inside Windsor and placed their signatures on a document that would not be released to the public in full. There were no cameras permitted in that room. There was no transcript made available. What emerged from it was not a press release or a royal proclamation. It was a structural reality, quiet, permanent, and far more consequential than anything that had been said out loud during the weeks that preceded it. King Charles signed first, not in his capacity as a grandfather with a personal emotional stake in the well-being of 2 young children. He signed as sovereign. Prince William signed next. Not as a brother-in-law navigating a painful family situation. He signed as heir apparent. Princess Anne signed last, not as an aunt, as Princess Royal, in her long-established role as the embodiment of procedural duty over personal sentiment. 3 signatures. That was the entirety of the visible action, and yet those 3 signatures converted everything that had been building across the preceding weeks from internal documentation into operational permanence. The Windsor Convention Clause, which had been revised following Brexit to clarify cross-border authority over royal minors, was formally activated alongside the signing. What this meant in concrete terms was that the Crown was granted primary custodial guardianship under stabilisation review. Not symbolic oversight, not an advisory role in decisions being made elsewhere. Operational authority, the kind that does not ask for cooperation. The kind that does not require the agreement of the other parties involved in order to function. The internal code name for the coordinated operation that followed was Dandelion. The name sounds almost gentle. The execution was anything but casual. A private jet departed within hours under diplomatic clearance. No press manifest was filed, no visible entourage was documented. The purpose was not dramatic in the way that headlines tend to demand drama. It was administrative, precise, and carried out with the kind of efficiency that only comes from having prepared for this exact scenario long before it became necessary to act on it. The measures that accompanied the signing built on what had already been implemented in the days prior. The passport lockdown was extended and formalised, restricting international travel for Archie and Lilibet until the age of 16 without Crown-approved escort. The image rights lockdown under the Windsor Privacy Act remained binding. The Royal Restoration Fund, £12 million secured under Crown trusteeship, was fully operational. Catherine, Anne and Edward were confirmed as trustees under the new framework, not in any ceremonial sense, but as fiduciaries with genuine financial and structural governance responsibilities. There was one additional element that received little public attention but carried significant weight within the institutional context. A confidential memorandum, reportedly originating from a direction given under Queen Elizabeth II in 2020, was invoked to reinforce a single principle. No claim rooted in emotional legacy, including any narrative connection to Princess Diana, could be used as leverage in commercial negotiations involving the children. The memorandum drew a firm line between personal memory, which belongs to individuals, and institutional legacy, which does not. That line had now been drawn in permanent ink. What the institution had done across the span of roughly a week was convert a pattern of documented irregularities into a constitutionally grounded transfer of structural authority. The prenuptial agreement had provided the legal foundation. The compliance deviations had provided the justification. The Edwardian Protocol had provided the mechanism. And the 3 signatures on the 3rd of February had provided the finality. Meghan had not been publicly condemned in any of this. No official statement named her as the cause of the crisis. No royal spokesperson gave an on-record account of what had gone wrong or who was responsible. The institutional response had been deliberately contained within the language of protection and stabilization rather than punishment and blame. But language does not erase impact. She had lost unilateral narrative control. She had lost operational access to commercial pathways involving the children. She had lost the ability to make structural decisions about their lives without reference to a framework she no longer governed. Whether she had lost everything depended on what you considered essential. Control is structural. Once it shifts, reclaiming it requires more than intention. It requires demonstrated compliance over time, documented correction, and a willingness to operate within the very institutional framework that had just reasserted itself so forcefully. Identity, on the other hand, is more resilient than structure. It can be rebuilt, it can find new ground. But rebuilding takes time, and the window for the particular reinvention that had apparently been in development was now considerably narrower than it had been at the start of January. For Harry, the 3rd of February clarified something that the preceding weeks had been gradually making visible. The document signed in that chamber did not list him as an adversary. It did not remove him from the line of succession. It did not declare him unfit or unworthy or unwelcome. What it did was settle, without room for ambiguity, the question of where decision-making, authority now resided, and the answer to that question did not include him. He had been informed. He had not been consulted. The institution had moved, and it had moved without needing him in order to do so. In Botswana, the news of the signing would have reached him in that same quiet, procedural way that the denial of his visitation request had arrived. Not with confrontation, not with an invitation to respond, simply as information about a situation he was no longer positioned to influence in any immediate sense. The path back, if he chose to take it, ran through compliance, through residency documentation and income transparency and jurisdictional clarity, and the kind of sustained, verifiable demonstration of stability that the review framework demanded. It was not an impossible path, but it was a long one, and it began with choices he had not yet publicly indicated he was prepared to make. The Crown, for its part, did not celebrate. Institutions of this kind do not mark these outcomes with visible satisfaction. They absorb them. They file them. They move forward on the assumption that permanence is its own justification, that the machinery built across centuries to protect continuity does not require external validation in order to function. The files would remain. Some are sealed, some partially open, some containing annexes not yet referenced in any public account of events. Constitutional files do not always close when the immediate crisis resolves. They remain available, they remain relevant, they wait. The question that lingered across oceans and across the very different silences of Windsor and Botswana and California was not whether the institution had acted. It clearly had, decisively, and with a precision that left little room for doubt about its preparedness. The question was what came next, whether Meghan would find a way to operate within a landscape that had been fundamentally reshaped around her, whether Harry would choose the structured path back toward institutional alignment or continue to orbit the edge of a world that had just demonstrated it could function entirely without his participation, and whether the Crown, having moved this far and this fast, had fully accounted for the human cost of machinery that wins by documentation rather than by dialogue. The most powerful instrument in any institution built on permanence is not the dramatic gesture. It is the file that sits in a sealed room, dated and witnessed, waiting for the moment when the pattern it was designed to address finally makes itself visible. That file had been waiting since 2018. It had done its work. And as the ink dried on the 3rd of February, the story that the world had been watching as a very public family drama had resolved itself, at least in structural terms, in the quietest possible way. Not with a confrontation, not with a declaration, with 3 signatures and the silence that followed them.